The ground in the upper Willamette Valley of Oregon froze to a depth of 18 inches on November the 28th, 1887, and Ingrid Overa drove the last post of her pole barn into the earth 11 days before that, on November 17th, with 36 degrees of working temperature left and a mallet she had shaped herself from a section of Oregon white oak that she had carried out of the lower timber stand on her shoulder. The post went in solid. She tamped the hole with the heel of her boot and stepped back to look at what she had built. 9 posts, 8 bays, a ridgeline of peeled fir 32 feet long, 41 feet of covered animal shelter, open on the south face, roofed with split cedar shakes she had rived from a wind-fallen cedar 200 yards upslope. She had started on September 21st, 57 days earlier, with a crosscut saw, a felling axe, a broad axe, a draw knife, a mole, a hand auger, 3 chisels, and no help she hadn't earned by helping first. Her name was Ingrid Overa, and she was 29 years old, and what she had built in those 57 days was the reason her 2 milk cows, her 8 sheep, and her 14 chickens survived the winter of 1887 to 1888 intact, which was more than could be said for 2 other livestock operations in the county. She had come to the Willamette Valley in 1883 from the fjord district of western Norway near Hardanger, where her father, Knut, had been a tømmermann, a timberman, a word that in Norwegian carried the specific meaning of someone who worked wood from its standing form all the way to its built form, who understood the tree before it was a post, and the post before it was a building. Knut Overa had built 3 boat sheds, a grain barn, 2 privies, and significant portions of his own house in his working life, and he had done all of it without milled lumber, because milled lumber in the Hardanger Fjord district in the 1860s required transport that was expensive and often unavailable. You built from what the land produced. You understood how a log became a post, how a post became a frame, how a frame became a structure that would hold a specific load in a specific wind, and you understood it well enough to do it without a manual. Ingrid had worked beside him from the age of 9, not carrying tools, using them. Knut Overa was not a man who believed in teaching by lecture. He taught by standing beside the person he was teaching and correcting their grip and their angle and their stroke, until the result was what it needed to be. By the time Ingrid was 14, she could read the grain of a standing tree, whether it would split cleanly for shakes or twist under the axe, by looking at the bark pattern and the lean of the upper limbs. By the time she left for America, she could mortise and tine in a joint that held without peg or nail, peel a log clean with a draw knife in a single sustained pass, and calculate the bearing load of a ridgeline based on the span and the expected snow load. She did not have a husband. She had not had one. She had come to Oregon with her older brother Torger, who had died of typhoid fever in 1885, leaving her the claim and the livestock and the cabin he had built the first summer, a solid structure of hewn fir logs that she had chinked and improved over 2 subsequent winters, and that was adequate for herself and the animals through mild weather. The animals were the problem. Torgeir had not built a barn. He had intended to. He had spoken about it with the specificity of someone who had a plan, but the plan had died with him in August, and the animals had spent 2 winters in the south-facing lean-to attached to the cabin's east wall, which was crowded and inadequately insulated and cost Ingrid 2 sheep to a January cold snap in the winter of 1886. She was not willing to lose 2 more. The timber she needed for the pole barn was, in one sense, already provided. A windstorm in September 1886 had knocked down 7 mature Douglas fir trees along the property's upper margin. Large trees, straight-grained, sound through the heartwood, exactly the diameter she needed for primary posts. They lay where they had fallen for a full year, which was, as it happened, an ideal duration for green fir to begin its seasoning, Not fully dry. You couldn't have fully dry posts from year-old fallen timber, but sufficiently reduced in moisture content that the shrinkage during the first winter of use would be manageable, and the post and ground contact rot that plagued green timber used immediately would be reduced by the partial drying. She had looked at those 7 trees for a full year before she touched them. Torger had looked at them too, and thought about a barn. She had thought about a barn, and then thought further than that, about which trees were straight enough for posts, and which were better for rafters, which had the grain pattern that would split cleanly for shakes, which had a natural bend that would work with or against the structure depending on how they were oriented. She knew their individual characters before she cut them. That was her father's first lesson. Know the tree. She began on September the 21st, 1887, because she had calculated, working backward from November 15th as her last reliable post-setting date, that she had 55 working days, which was enough if she did not lose significant time to rain. The Willamette Valley in October is not reliably rainless, and she built 2 rain days per week into her schedule from the start, which meant her effective working time was 39 days. 39 days for 9 posts, 8 roof beams, 2 intermediate purlins, a ridgeline, 41 linear feet of rafter pairs, and a complete cedar shake roof. It was not a comfortable margin. It was a margin. The first 3 weeks, September 21st through October 12th, she spent on timber preparation. Each of the 7 wind-fallen firs needed to be bucked to length, limbed, peeled, and worked to a consistent diameter using the broad axe and draw knife. The posts she cut to 10 feet, 8 feet of above-ground height for livestock clearance, 2 feet of below-ground anchor depth, a ratio she calculated based on the soil type. The clay loam of the valley floor held a post at a 2-to-8 ratio reliably, meaning 2 feet of depth for 8 feet of height. Go shorter on the anchor in clay loam, and a wet winter soil expansion cycle would heave the post over 2 or 3 seasons. 2 feet held. She peeled each post with the draw knife herself, working from one end to the other in long sweeping passes that curled the bark away in wet ribbons smelling of resin and the slightly fermented sweetness of year-old cambium. The work left a callus on the inside of her right thumb, where the draw knife handle wore against it, and by the end of the first week she had packed the raw skin with rendered tallow each evening to keep it from cracking open. The posts, once peeled, dried visibly over subsequent days, the pale cream heartwood darkening slightly as the surface moisture left, the grain tightening, the weight per foot reducing to something she could manage alone with the cant hook her father had given her when she left Norway. Setting the posts required more than muscle. The post holes had to be placed with precision sufficient to keep the completed frame square. A leaning or off-square pole barn would rack in the first wind and potentially collapse under a heavy snow load. She established her layout with a string line and stakes, measuring the diagonals of the planned footprint to confirm squarely before she dug the first hole. Her diagonal measurements, 63 feet and 7 inches on both diagonals of the 41 by 24-foot footprint, confirmed her layout to within a quarter inch. Then she dug. The valley floor in late September was workable but not easy, a spade's depth of loamy topsoil over sticky clay that resisted the bar below 14 inches and required prying rather than stabbing. She spent approximately 3 hours per post hole, varying with the clay density she encountered at depth. 9 holes was 27 hours of digging. She had not included this in her original schedule, and it cost her 4 days she had allocated to roofing preparation. She revised her plan accordingly. 3 fewer rain day reserves, an extra hour of work at each end of the usable daylight. The result was a schedule with essentially no slack left in it by mid-October. Wilhelm Voss, age 63, was the valley's most respected authority on farm construction. He had built 7 barns and 4 houses in the county over 31 years of settlement-era carpentry, and his opinion was sought and given regularly. He rode past the Over AI property on October the 14th when the posts were in the ground and Ingrid was working on the first roof beam connection, and he stopped at the fence with the expression of a man who has seen something unexpected. The posts were not mortised at the top in the way a conventionally framed barn would be. Instead, she had used a bird's mouth notch, a V-shaped cut in the top of each post, sized to receive the roof beam without through mortise, secured with a single wooden peg driven horizontally through both post and beam. It was a Japanese timber framing technique, not a Norwegian one and not a particularly common one in Oregon Valley farming in 1887. She had seen it in a drawing in a farming magazine left at the post office. A Japanese agricultural barn illustrated in an article about rice farming practices, and she had recognized immediately that the bird's mouth connection was superior for her specific material. Irregular diameter round poles that would have been difficult to mortise cleanly, but that could receive a precise notch cut with a chisel and a saw. Voss looked at the connection for a while from his horse. "That's not how you joint a post," he said. "It is now," Ingrid said, which was not intended as an insult. It was a statement of what she had decided after 3 weeks of working with round poles that didn't behave like milled lumber. Voss dismounted and walked closer. He tested the connection with both hands, pushing laterally, pushing upward, checking for play. There was minimal play. The peg held the beam snug in the notch, and the notch transferred the beam's vertical load to the post's bearing surface, rather than to the peg, which meant the peg was working in shear rather than tension, a mechanically superior arrangement for a wooden fastener. "Where did you learn that?" Voss asked. "Magazine," she said. Voss stood looking at it. He was a man who had learned carpentry the way most men in his generation learned it, from the person before him, who had learned it from the person before them, in a tradition that was reliable and that had produced results for 30 years, but that had not necessarily produced the best possible connection for round pole construction. The bird's mouth was better for this material, and he knew enough to know it. He did not say so. He rode on. He came back 3 days later and looked at it again without speaking to Ingrid. Then he rode home. The following spring, when he built a lean-to addition to his own cowshed using round poles from a timber sale, he cut bird's mouth notches at every post top. Marta Hofstad, age 47, was the settlement's most active voice on practical farming questions, a Norwegian immigrant herself from Telemark who had been in the valley since 1877 and who commanded real social authority through the combination of 10 years' experience and an unsentimental directness that people had learned to trust. She stopped by the property on October 23rd and looked at the frame from the gate for several minutes before coming in. Her concern was the shake roof. "Cedar shakes on a round pole frame," she said. "The shakes want a nailed sheathing board under them. You're nailing directly to purlins that aren't flat. You'll have gaps. Every gap is a leak, and a leaking roof is worse than no roof for livestock. Wet animals in a cold barn lose heat faster than animals in an open field." It was a legitimate concern, and one that Ingrid had thought about carefully. The purlins she had used, secondary horizontal members running between the rafter pairs, were not round poles but split-faced fir, riven with a froe and a maul from a straight-grained section of the windfall, and smoothed on the upper face with the broad axe to within a quarter-inch of flat. The cedar shakes would nail to a surface that was, while not perfect, flat enough to seat cleanly if the shakes were graded correctly and laid with sufficient overlap. She had graded the shakes herself, 2 weeks of riving in the evenings after the main construction day was done, sorting each shake by width and thickness, setting aside any that were warped or cupped, keeping only those that laid flat when pressed. 40% of her arrived shakes had been culled. The remaining 60% would go on in 3 courses of overlap, which meant that any gap in the first course was covered by the second course, and any gap in the second was covered by the third. A triple-course cedar shake roof, properly laid, did not leak unless the shakes themselves were defective, and she had culled the defective ones. "My purlins are face flat," she said, "and my shakes are triple-coursed." Marta looked at the split-faced purlins on the nearest rafter bay. She ran her palm across one, approximately flat, not perfectly, but adequately. "Triple-coursed," she said. It was a statement of calculation, not approval. "That's twice the material." "I arrived twice the material," Ingrid said. Marta was quiet for a moment. "The extra riving took what, 2 weeks of evenings?" 11 days, Ingrid said. Marta nodded slowly, which in her particular vocabulary meant the math holds. She left without further objection. These accounts, the practical ingenuity of people building from what the land provided, without the luxury of purchased materials or professional help, are the kind of history that disappears when nobody writes it down. If this story is reaching you, please subscribe and leave a like. These women and men deserve a larger audience than they ever received in their own lifetimes. The third voice of skepticism came from a younger man, Lars Bergstrom, age 32, a Norwegian farmer 2 properties south who had arrived in the valley the same year as Ingrid and who had built his own barn in 1885 with milled lumber purchased in Portland, hauled at considerable expense, and assembled with hired help. He was not unkind. He was proud of his barn, and he had paid for the pride in full. And this gave him a particular perspective on what shortcuts looked like. He stopped by on November 3rd, when the roof framing was complete, and Ingrid was beginning to lay shakes. "The poles aren't uniform diameter," he said. "The ridgeline will sag in the middle by spring. You haven't accounted for the differential shrinkage between the large diameter posts and the small diameter rafters." He was partly right. Round poles shrink as they dry, and they shrink more in diameter than in length. A post that is 8 inches in diameter, when green, will be approximately 7 inches after 2 seasons of drying. If adjacent posts are significantly different diameters and shrink at different rates, the connections between them can loosen, and a ridgeline that relied on uniform shrinkage to maintain its tension could sag at points where the differential was greatest. Ingrid had selected her ridgeline poles specifically to minimize this risk. The 3 members that made up the 32-foot ridgeline were all from the same section of the windfall, adjacent trees of similar diameter, cut from the same growth zone, with similar moisture content and similar grain density. Their differential shrinkage over 2 seasons would be, at most, a 1/4 inch. She had also installed the ridgeline with a deliberate slight camber, a shallow upward bow of approximately 3/4 of an inch at the midpoint, to compensate for the settling she expected as the connections tightened and the wood dried. A cambered ridgeline. It was a technique her father had used on every structure he built with green timber, and he had explained it to her in terms that were practical rather than technical. You build it a little proud, and it settles to flat. If you build it flat, it settles to sad. She explained the camber to Bergstrom. He looked at the ridgeline. The slight upward bow was visible if you sighted along it from the gable end. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think of that," he said. "My father did," she said, 30 years ago. The roofing took 9 days. She worked from the eave upward on each bay, nailing the first course of shakes with 3 penny nails through their faces, the second course offset by half a shake width to stagger the joints, the third course offset again. The stagger pattern meant that no 2 vertical joints aligned across 3 courses, eliminating the continuous gap that would channel water through. At the ridge, she bent the final course of shakes over the peak and nailed them from both sides. Not a perfect ridge cap, which required a separate bent piece, but a serviceable one that shed water on both sides and would last 3 to 4 years before needing replacement. On November the 17th, she drove the last post of a small interior partition, a pen for the sheep, separate from the cow section, which she had designed to reduce heat loss from the main animal space by confining the sheep's body heat to a smaller volume. She tamped the hole. She stepped back. Done. The first significant test of the structure came on December the 14th, 1887, when a sustained wind from the southeast, a Willamette Valley atmospheric pattern that occasionally pushed unusually warm, moist air inland from the coast before dropping it suddenly as a cold snap, drove a 2-day rain followed by a drop to 19 degrees Fahrenheit. The transition from wet-warm to cold created the worst possible test for an open-sided barn. Water-soaked bedding, cold animals, and wind driving through the south-facing opening. Ingrid's cows and sheep came through it without losses. She had lined the interior partition walls with a layer of cedar bark, the waste product of her shake-riving operation, otherwise useless, which she had pinned to the uprights with wooden skewers. The cedar bark reduced the draft inside the partition by approximately 60% and retained body heat in the animal space at a meaningful level. The chickens, in a separate enclosed box of rough-sawn fir boards within the southeast corner of the barn, lost not one bird. The 2 operations in the county that lost livestock in the December cold snap were both using conventional open-sided lean-tos without interior partitions. One family lost 3 sheep. The other lost a calf and sustained frostbite damage to a significant fraction of their flock. Ingrid lost nothing. Wilhelm Voss came to see the barn in late December, ostensibly to look at the bird's mouth connections after the structure had experienced a month of weather loading. He examined each post top, tested the connections with his hands, looked at the ridgeline from the gable end. The slight camber Ingrid had built in had settled to within 1/16 of an inch of flat. The shake roof had shed the rain and freeze cycle without visible leak damage to the interior. The cedar bark partition walls were intact. He stood in the middle of the barn for a long time, looking at the construction with the careful attention of a man revising a professional opinion. "I would have used mortise and tenon at the post tops," he said finally. "Through mortised with a drawbore pin." "I know," Ingrid said. "This is better for this material," he said. It cost him something to say it. He said it anyway. That was the character of Wilhelm Voss, and it was one of his better qualities. If you followed this account all the way to its end, I'm grateful. Please take a moment to like this video. These stories find their audience one like at a time, and everyone matters. Ingrid Overae farmed the Willamette Valley claim until 1903, when she sold it and moved to Portland. The pole barn she built in 57 days in the autumn of 1887 stood on the property for 22 years, longer than many conventionally framed barns built the same decade with milled lumber, because milled lumber of that era was often cut from fast-grown second-growth timber with inferior heartwood, while Ingrid's round poles were old-growth Douglas fir, dense and resinous and nearly impervious to rot. The last entry in the property records that references the barn specifically is from 1909, when the new owners noted it as in good repair and serviceable. It was 22 years old. The pole barn, as a structural type, is one of the oldest forms of agricultural building in human history. In Northern Europe, the stave church tradition of the Vikings employed round poles set in the ground as primary vertical members, with horizontal members lashed or jointed at the tops, a design that, in its best preserved examples, the stave churches of Norway that still stand today, some from the 12th century, has demonstrated 800-year durability in a climate as demanding as any in the inhabited world. The principle was the same as Ingrid's barn. The round pole, properly selected and seasoned and positioned in the earth at the correct depth ratio, is structurally efficient in a way that milled lumber is not, because its natural taper distributes load along the full length of the member rather than concentrating it at cross-section planes. You lose some precision at the connections. You gain something more fundamental in the material. In Japan, the traditional Minka farmhouse tradition achieved its remarkable structural longevity through the same preference for natural form timber, used with understanding rather than uniformity imposed on it. The great farmhouses of the Shirakawa-go Valley, some standing for 3 centuries, used bent timber where a Western carpenter would reject it as defective, turned so that the natural curve works with the structural load rather than against it, bracing the frame through geometry rather than through mass. The knowledge required to read a tree and know which curve goes where is the same knowledge Knut Overay taught his daughter in the Hardanger Fjord, and that she carried across the North Pacific and applied with a borrowed crosscut saw and a draw knife worn smooth from years of her father's grip before it became hers. Ingrid Overay did not publish her methods. She did not teach a class or write a guide. She built a barn that worked in 57 days from fallen timber and inherited knowledge, and it stood for 22 years on the Oregon Rain, which is a form of publication that certain kinds of knowledge prefer. The trees had been waiting on the hillside for a year. She had been waiting longer than that.